Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming here today. I hope you've been enjoying the symposium. This is the fourth one that I've been at here at Amazon Web Services, and each year we get more and more people. So thank you for coming to this session. We've heard today from, especially on the keynote this morning, we've heard about a lot of things that people are doing in cloud services. We've heard from the Seattle Police Department about what they're doing to be more citizen-centric. We've heard from the Singapore government on what they're doing, and other groups talking about what they're doing for the citizen. I'm also been involved with, I'm particularly excited about some of the things that we're seeing around scientific research, especially around computational biomedical research. What we've been seeing is changes in the ways scientists can do things, and especially in the way that they can get things going faster and collaborate better. So what we put together today for you is a panel of people that are working in this area and kind of at the forefront of some of these big changes that we're seeing in scientific research. And so here we have Ansh Patnaik from Delphix, and then Vivien Bonazzi from NIH, and Erin Black from the research portion of INOVA. So to get it started off, Ansh, do you want to give a little overview of yourself?
Sure. Ansh Patnaik. I'm responsible for industry solutions at a company called Delphix. Delphix is a software platform that can reside on premises or in the cloud, including AWS and AWS Gov. We call it data as a service, and the fundamental problem that data as a service solves is that application projects, regardless of whether they're tied to research or some other application, require and depend on a lot of data. So it could be the rollout of a packaged application. It might be custom application development. It may be pushing data into the cloud for things like genomics. All of these projects are very data intensive, and the way DAS simplifies that is by turning data into an on-demand resource that can be delivered anywhere on demand in minutes. So I'll leave it at that, and we're at booth 50. If you want to hear more about us, we'd love to chat further.
Okay. Vivian?
Sure. I'm Vivian Benassi. I'm from NIH, and I'm from the Office of the Associate Director of Data Science. My role there is to look at data science technologies. I'm a computational biologist, and looking at those technologies as applicable to the type of biomedical data we have at NIH. To sort of follow on from what Ansh was saying, we generate a lot of data. I think for those of you who were here for the previous talk, there's a genomic data, there's certainly an explosion with that, but there's tons of other data that we have that is extremely difficult to analyze because we don't have the right platforms to do that. So what we're noticing is that there are many NIH grantees that are moving some of their data to the cloud in different forms, different shapes. And as Ansh was saying, it's not as straightforward as you'd expect it to be. And so what we're doing is exploring what does it take to do that, what does it take to do the analysis there, and why? And so that's one of the things we're looking at at NIH.
Erin Black, Director of Informatics for the INOVA Translational Medicine Institute. INOVA is a health system just outside of Washington, D.C. in the Northern Virginia area. Our institute started about 5 years ago. I was brought in about 2 years ago to help manage the data that we're accumulating as part of our research, and then we're also spinning up clinical testing within the health system. We are an Amazon user. We've been on it for about 4 years now. We manage about 1.5 petabytes of data in Amazon right now, and we also have a hybrid cloud environment where we have HPC, a cluster sitting at INOVA, and we've created a link between the two. So we've run into a lot of the issues of data management, data security, things that we're pushing right now within a health system. So we're a research environment within a health system. So politically, in a risk-averse environment, we're trying to find our way to make sure we're doing this the right way.
Great, thanks. So why don't we say, you can go from the other end, since you're talking about large data sets. Can you tell a little bit about how researchers are taking advantage of these large data sets, especially in a collaborative way?
For us, it's created a place where we have a little bit more freedom in order to create these collaborations. We have to do that in a secure way, but the cloud has almost enabled us to do that faster. Getting the buy-in from the health system was a challenge. But once we've had that, when we want to share with a group in Seattle, a group in Boston, we don't have to move the data, which has really been the big delimiter. Storage now doesn't seem to be as big as an issue as it might have been in the past due to all the presentations and everybody here in the cloud, but to move it is still an issue. The pipes don't get bigger necessarily, so the cloud has enabled us to share data in place.
Right. Thanks. Vivian, so NIH has a tremendous number of data sets, funds a lot of data sets and everything. Can you talk a little bit about how researchers are taking advantage of that today and how that differs from the past?
Yeah. So the biggest example of this is genomic data. The cost of DNA sequencing has gone down a lot, and so the ability to generate data sets is faster and cheaper, and you generate a lot of data. But we're also getting a lot of image data and other forms of data which are all digital, and that's changing over time. So we've got an increasing amount of complexity of data and more of it. And what people need to do, as Erin was saying, is you want to co-locate your data with tools, which is the obvious reason to use the cloud. And what NIH has been looking at is we have some data sets up on the cloud. We've done work with Amazon on the human microbiome data set, which is up on Amazon. There's also the 1,000 genomes data set, which, for those of you in the previous talk, which is a 70 petabyte, is that right? No, it's a 7 terabyte data set. The microbiome is about 40 terabytes. It's impossible for people to download it locally, even if they have the capacity, few have that. To download that locally and do the analysis is impossible. So what people are doing is wanting to take their tools to the data and do the analysis there. The problem is the consistency issue there. Right now people are doing it through their credit cards or through procurement systems at universities. There's two problems with that, is that the system is kind of, it's not the most optimized way to do it. And the second thing is there's a difference between obviously business and research dollars in terms of the research grants often don't match up well with obviously commercial rates. Now the cloud providers have been providing a tremendous benefit, I think, with the credit system that you have, but like all things, it's not endless. So we're looking at, within NIH, since we know we're going to generate lots of data, what's the right way to approach the cloud in the way that we can actually do that? And as Erin was saying, part of the issue is being biomedical, we have human subjects issues. So the data sets I've just described now are de-identified and have minimal issues in terms of identifiability. But we do have a lot of data sets that have human subjects issues that are very sensitive for obvious reasons. And so we're looking at how do we start with data sets that don't have those problems, and then how do we also look at data sets that do have those issues. Again, for those of you who know about these type of data sets, dbGaP, the database of genotypes and phenotypes, is exactly that. And we've been looking at what is the right way to have that served in the cloud, and how do we also handle the policy issues around having that data in the cloud.
Great, thanks. Ansh?
I think where we fit in is around some of the problems that were mentioned here. One being, storage may not be an issue in terms of primary costs, but as you said, there's a big challenge to moving data sets around, large data sets. You have to acquire it from somewhere. And we see this every day with customers trying to move to the cloud. How do I get the data into the cloud? There's a cost to that. There are bandwidth costs, there's I/O costs, there's compute tier costs. So that's one area where DAS platforms can make a big difference, because what we're essentially doing is virtualizing the data. So if you think of a source, we make a copy of it, and then now it's much easier to push it around to different places because you're essentially working off of virtual data sets. And we have organizations in the sector like the European Bioinformatics Institute that's doing exactly that for their larger data sets. They're virtualizing it, now they're able to push it anywhere for research, for data warehousing, and for analytics. There's a second angle around this, which is around security that you brought up. A lot of this data, especially in this sector, is highly sensitive in nature and has to be de-identified. And traditional mechanisms of de-identification have only added overhead to the process, have added overhead to the process of moving data around. You have to move it, but each time you get incremental data, it needs to be de-identified again. And the opportunity with DAS is to do that once and then create virtual copies of it that can facilitate research and collaboration either locally or in AWS.
Great, thanks. So I often find that now technology is moving so fast that technology is no longer the barrier. Yeah, and I'll open it up to anyone. Can you talk a little bit about institutional, either within your institution or within multiple institutions, what some of the barriers are and what, for moving forward with computational research, especially in a cloud-type environment?
Well, I come from the 6,000-pound Gorilla Institute. There's a lot of problems. I think from an NIH perspective, traditionally a biomedical institute has not been heavily on computing, and it's understanding that it needs it, but it's still relatively early days for NIH. So there's a level of understanding that's lacking in terms of what these technologies really are and how they can be used, which is the job of what our office is and definitely what my job is. So there's that. And then also, when you're dealing with an institution, particularly, I think as these gentlemen have been saying, when you've got human subjects issues, it's a really big issue. There are long and complex policies, and they don't change overnight. So even though the technologies are moving quickly, the policies do not, and I think sometimes that's a problem, but sometimes it's a good thing because you don't want to change something dramatically, etc. You might have a better job at this, Erin, because when you have clinical trials or you're looking at a set of data from consented individuals, you have to go back and see whether the consent that they did originally had submitted for can now actually work in the same environment that you're now suggesting to move in. And you have to be very careful of that because people that have consented on studies don't suddenly want to find themselves in a different situation. So the policies are there to protect them. They can be slow, but sometimes that's a good thing.
I would agree. Technology is going so fast that not only in that respect, so we have to manage, as data managers, manage that whether it's a checkbox, it's a flip, it's some kind of metadata that tells you exactly how you can use it and then who alerts you when you move it somewhere, right? It's not automatic unless you have built that into the mechanism of collecting that data. And when you have data at that size and it's that discrete and it's multiple layers of it, it's images, it's individual sequences, and the more complicated you make that, the more complicated it becomes for data managers to adhere to. The second part to that is with all these new technologies is getting a staff up to speed on what that technology is. This is not talent in cloud and talent in Hadoop and all these buzzwords you hear is not just readily available for you to consume. You have to find and procure that talent. So it might be there for you to use, but are you using it effectively?
Yeah, great. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think when you talk about barriers beyond technology, obviously privacy and security come up a lot as policy-related issues. I think there's also an IP element. There's a trend towards data monetization, which makes companies think about, well, do I share this? How do they think about profit-driven motives, which is fair for publicly held organizations to think of it that way. And in fact, there are examples of JP Morgan, for example, having shared data on thousands of its subsidiaries that was driven not by any altruism or philanthropy, but entirely by finding that it could affect their bottom line. Similarly, it's not in this sector necessarily, but Walmart has shared, given a lot of access to hundreds of factories' supply chain data, again because it's realized that there's the benefits outweigh the risks, and I think that's a good thing for, regardless of whether we're thinking of healthcare or other sectors, for the industry as a whole to find ways to demonstrate that the benefits of sharing data in the interest of research or other benefits outweigh the risks.
Great, thanks. So can any of you kind of give us some specific examples of how commercial cloud resources are playing a part in research collaboration?
I've heard of actually there are a lot. I'm not familiar with all of them, but there are examples of, I know there's one called Foldit that some folks may have heard about. It's a game, you can play it online, but the idea is to crowdsource science and allow folks to play with these 3D versions of protein images and change their shapes, because if you're trying to figure out what shape it's going to fall into, because the shapes that proteins fall into determine their functions, and proteins play very important functions in our bodies. And so it's a great example of how data has been shared and now it's crowdsourced to the benefit of broader science. There's another one called Polymath that I've heard of. I don't know a lot of details on it, but apparently it's crowdsourcing solution to major math problems. So those are some examples.
Great.
So the ones for NIH were some of the ones I mentioned before. So the human microbiome data, which is up on Amazon, is accessible to anyone. You can go search it, do whatever you want on it. There's also tools up there that came from the project. The Human Microbiome Project and its tools were publicly funded, and the data is available to anyone. All you're paying for is the compute. There are several other projects happening. There's the National Cancer Institute's cloud pilots, which are looking at the TCGA data, which is the Cancer Genome Atlas data, which is cancer data from a collection of, I think, 5 different cancers and different stages, and actually looking at the variations on the genomes of each of those different types of cancers at different stages. That data, because it's related to, obviously, clinical data from patients, is protected. So that data is not available at the moment unless you have special permissions and authorizations to access that. But the project that I've described for the NCI Cloud Pilot and also the Genomic Data Commons is sitting on AWS and also on Google as a testing point to see when you have that much data, which is in the many terabytes, how do you analyze that and reanalyze that and present it using that cloud environment? What are the right environments? I think as you were describing before, Ansh was saying, getting it in there is not as simple as you think it is. Also running various tools in that environment is not as simple as it looks. In the case of NIH, the percentage of folks with computational background is relatively small compared to the rest of the organization. So getting it ready in such a form that when it is made public, that people can consume it, 1, with the right authorization, and 2, with the ability to actually do that. We're looking at more and more data sets, and we're working with a collection of different providers for one main reason, because we certainly can't house it locally. It's just too big, and even if you house it, you want to do something with it, and what the cloud does is obviously allows you to co-locate data and tools, which is the key thing behind it for what we do.
I just want to echo everything, all these open data sources we use. I mean, as part of our genomic research, we're referencing those. We're actually using that as a service for us that we are, leveraging. So, ecosystem completely, the ecosystem is being built on cloud is actually providing us a service, day one.
Okay.
So I'd just like to add to that, what we want to do is to assist groups, whoever they may be, that if you can consume this publicly available data, and in particular clinics that actually can do this, it's really important, because what you're wanting to do is to make those data available. For example, the Cancer Genome Atlas project, which shows obviously information about cancer and can really be diagnostic in places. Folks like you groups can actually take advantage of that for diagnostic purposes and also for treatment of patients. So we want people to consume the information in the appropriate fashion so that their organizations can take best treatments to patients as quickly as possible. That's what our goal is.
Great, thanks. So the bottom line in all this is really to speed up the rate of medical discovery and to give everybody the tools that they can do to move faster and have higher quality research. Can any of you talk a little bit about what you think is happening in the speed at which medical discovery is happening with these large data sets and ability to collaborate?
Yeah, I can start. A lot of it for us, I actually was part of the TCGA project at the low level. So I was at Nationwide Children's Hospital, or Peter White if he's here, Peter. So I was there and built a lot of the infrastructure there. And so in the last 6 years, as I've moved from that to where we are now, and we're able to utilize these tools, is that things are able to go much faster. Now, sometimes it's a scary fast, but it's faster, and we have more tools available to us that we didn't have before. A lot of repeatability with this, and more like infrastructure as code. There's a lot of things that we're able to take advantage of now that 4 or 5 years ago, some of the lessons that we learned in TCGA across, we were a contractor at that point, just trying to understand. Now we're finding out what we did wrong. And so the faster, from an informatics and from an IT perspective, we can do that, the faster we can get the real data to the right people who are the talented people who can actually do stuff with that data.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably going to be a little redundant here, but I think I would go back to some of the same things, which is that the things that bottleneck research projects. Let's take an example of a university research department, maybe it's biology department, something like that, that wants to kick off a certain research project. It's a collaborative project across a lot of universities. They want to share data. Obviously, that's a great example where it makes sense to use AWS. It would be prohibitively expensive for higher education institute to set up all that infrastructure rapidly, take too much time. So cost time, there's obviously security-related issues in sharing data. So this is where I think these large research collaboration projects can really leverage newer technologies that eliminate some of the big barriers to getting these projects going. You can stand up compute infrastructure really fast thanks to AWS, but again, data movement, bringing the data in, de-identifying that data is still very problematic, and that's where technologies like DAS can make a difference.
So most of these most of these large data sets have been traditionally funded by either a nonprofit organization or the government. And I'm curious what you would like to see the role of commercial providers being in this, producing, storing, and making available these large data sets.
By commercial providers, you mean not Amazon? You're talking about pharmaceutical companies or biotechs?
Any of the above. So what would you like to see cloud providers doing? What would you like to see all those other companies doing to help out?
Certainly in NIH, there's public-private partnerships, not just in terms of technology, in terms of computes, but obviously working with biotech and pharma companies as a way, what's the right way to share information, et cetera. I think everyone's realizing that if you have quite a lot of information that you can mine, that's really advantageous for anyone in those groups, be it researcher or biotech or industry. So I think there's going to be a move by some groups to have more of their data available. I've certainly seen cases where groups that are commercial who didn't want to share actually found it was more useful to share in the long term when there was actually essentially a tipping point, when the public data sets were larger than what they had and they couldn't necessarily assimilate them locally. So it was actually better to join them than to beat them. So I think you see an element of that. I think you're also going to get an element where people don't want to share for probably some good reasons and maybe some reasons just for privacy, IP, etc. So I think you're going to see a trend towards it. It's going to be a mindset and a culture change for some of these groups to decide to embrace that. And I think it'll be an interesting split that we get out of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I think the theme that we always run into is this competitive versus cooperative pressure. So the environment and research is usually you're going after a grant, you're trying to answer a question. It's very competitive, but you're eventually going to share with others. And really the goal of this is to make somebody's life better. If you're in a health system, you're trying to do good for the common good. But as far as like these companies coming in, if they can help us enable, they've run into some of these issues in other environments. And you've pointed out a couple, different industries. The healthcare industry for us, being at a healthcare system, is very risk averse. It's not, it doesn't embrace technology the way some of these other industries do. So if these other not for-profit commercialized companies come in and help us get to that point faster, that would help us.
Great.
I think there's probably two sides to it. One is policy and the other is technology. We already spoke about the technology-related barriers. But for a lot of organizations, like for example, we have a lot of healthcare customers, payers, and providers. And when we talk to them and about things like sharing information, especially externally, I'll give you a very simple example. We're a software vendor. If I asked one of our customers and I told them to share the database that they were virtualizing with our DAS platform and said, you're having this problem, send us the data, we'll be able to troubleshoot it better. It's not going to happen. So now think of it at scale, sharing it across lots of other collaboration, other collaborators. It's very challenging, and part of it goes back to policy. The regulators can't, at one hand, create so much regulatory oversight as they have, for example, in banking, where banks have had to step out of certain types of banking assets. So there has to be some balance between saying, we want you to share, private sector, because the private sector doesn't share much data today. We want you to share the data, but then at the same time have all these regulations that suggest there could be a lot of liability in it. There has to be some balance there that encourages them beyond just a profit motive.
Okay. Perfect, thanks. We have about 15 minutes left. Would it be okay if we opened to the audience to questions? Do we have an extra mic, or if not, I'll walk through. Oh, there is an extra. Are there any questions from the audience that you'd like to ask of the panelists? So, while you're thinking of questions, In the traditional, okay, great, go ahead.
I'll be brave and ask one here. For the discussion on earlier presentations was about having primary investigators, PIs, and running these studies. Has there been found where the PIs have the management skills or can develop the management skills to do this? Because I'm thinking of the biomedical researcher PIs that I've had. I couldn't imagine any of them running a problem where they cannot visualize everything that they're doing.
What's the problem? The PI's managing...
In other words, they're going to have, I guess at NIH with prima donna PIs, lots of postdocs, lots of grad students, lots of helpers, and they're all going to be doing a piece of something
Right.
in the cloud where the PI can't can possibly follow everything that's being done.
And the problem is concern for
Is
use
that,
of certain...
do any of the PIs have the skill set to manage the computational genomics or computational biology, or is it something that's going to have to be developed before it can be done more?
Yes and yes. So I would say that NIH traditionally has been clinical and biomedical research, of which computational methods have been coming along. But the percentage of that has been relatively small, but it's increasing. And so what you're finding is that there are PIs, researchers, principal investigators, who can do this. But it's a relatively small group compared to the large group that are funded by NIH. So one of the initiatives in NIH is workforce development, which is several-fold. One, which is educating the scientists out there about these technologies so they can better use them. That includes the folks in their lab. Also bringing folks that have that kind of background who want to work at NIH. There's been a long and sad tradition of a lot of folks coming in but getting treated often as the plumber, when there's an equivalence there in what you're doing with the biology. And also training folks at NIH, the program officers that manage the grants that are all deeply knowledgeable about science and have done science themselves, educating them about these technologies and how to use it. So those three prongs will take us to, hopefully, in the next generation for the reasons that you state. You want to be very careful. I do want to make, though, one point, that regardless of the PI's ability in the computing world, if they have access to, say, dbGaP data, they must get authorization through appropriate channels to use it. And it doesn't matter what their level of computing is. If they've signed on the dotted line that they're doing that, they're responsible for that data and they're held accountable for that. So, and it's a very important thing that does happen, and it's regardless of their computational knowledge. What we're asking for in the newer stages with dbGaP is they've got to have sign-off from their institutions that understand this kind of work as well before they agree to move forward with that, the use of those particular human subjects' data. It is still a concern for us, but we're trying to create the right situations where people can use the data, not be hindered by it, but be aware of the uses of it because it is secure data.
Okay.
Thanks. This one might not be a totally fair question, but I'll ask it anyways. There's been a lot of emphasis as we've been talking about sort of retooling and retraining existing scientists to do the work in the cloud. I'm kind of curious about the funnel. So are we also, is the education system making the appropriate changes such that new scientists coming to NIH or to any of your facilities, are they already coming with the skills to operate in the cloud, or is this going to be a perpetual retraining because we're not kind of fixing the problem further down the pipeline where it needs to be? Or is it even a training and education problem?
Yes, and it is a fair question. I think certainly what I'm seeing is the number of people requesting courses internally in NIH. So NIH is divided, there's intramural, which is intramural research, which is exactly like a research organization. That's a relatively small percentage, and the rest is extramural, which is the funding we give out. It's about 80% of the NIH budget. But of the intramural science that come to work at NIH, you're seeing an increased pressure in the courses that they're wanting to take. They're also taking an increased pressure in the kind of courses. It's not just Linux anymore or show me Unix. They're really wanting to learn how to use certain pipelines within the context of the newest technologies. And they often come in armed with the information themselves. That's one. On the extramural side, I'm seeing more and more grants coming in from people that have those skill sets. So it's growing. I still think it's somewhat of a funnel simply because it's a fairly new thing. Do I think it's going to get better? Yeah, and it's going to get, it probably will remain a funnel, but I think the bottom bit's going to be wider. Yeah, I think that's probably right. Does that make sense?
So is it okay, since I've worked with NIH quite a bit over the last few years, to add a little bit? And you tell me. I think one of the things that there's a recognition amongst the institutes on is many of these biologists or geneticists, they don't want to become computer scientists. They don't want to become an expert on the cloud. And so there is a move in a few areas for the institute to actually provide the data sets, the tool sets, and everything, so that they can just start working in their tool set. And so we're seeing this, Vivian mentioned earlier, the Human Microbiome Project. There's some specialized tool sets to do that. And so what they're doing is they've spent a lot of time taking that so that those researchers can immediately start working on that. We're seeing the same thing happen, the National Database for Autism Research, pulling together so those researchers don't have to spend a lot of time figuring out the cloud. They just want to do their research. And so these environments are being built so that those researchers can just go and run whatever tool set they want, and that's already available in the same environment that the data sets are there. Yep. Is that okay?
That comes with caveats, though, because when you don't know enough about it, you can incur costs that you don't necessarily want, let's put it that way. You may not see the costs that you're incurring in terms of what you're doing, or if you don't understand enough about the system, it may seem to you that it just works seamlessly and it's not that straightforward. But I think we need to cater for both sorts. NIH also funds a tremendous amount of computational biology grants, which are hardcore compute biology, which are folks that understand the biology, the medicine, and the computer science. And we need to continue funding those as much as we need to continue funding folks that just simply want to use those tools in that environment, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there another question? All right. Oh, I think I see one back there. Apologize, we've got spotlights in our eyes, so I'm seeing.
No, it's okay. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for coming to speak with us. You mentioned a lot of the benefits of AWS and moving from where you were to where you are. I just wanted to kind of ask this about and see if you can discuss the transition from the previous methodologies of storing our data to kind of what the current is on storing it within AWS, some of the challenges that you have encountered either from a technical perspective or maybe from a policy or process-driven or cultural perspective, and then how you were able to overcome some of those challenges in moving to the cloud.
Yeah, I can speak to that. The first thing that when I got to INOVA about 2 years ago, the first thing that we did was just try to account for everything. So actually my degree's in accounting and management systems, so the first thing I wanted to know is where's it all at? And so the Amazon has a nice object-oriented API. We could pull it, we could see where it was, we could see it move, who was touching it. So some of it was just understanding how people were using the data, and I think that came up in one of the presentations, it might have been yours. How are people actually using it? It's one thing to push a bunch of stuff out there, but if you don't know how they're using it, you don't know where to put it. And this data is so large that you need to think about your storage as kind of cold, hot, warm. Like if I touch it, how fast do I expect it to come back? And until you really get an idea of your landscape, it's difficult to know. So you ask that question to a researcher and they want it as fast as possible. Very dangerous to say go at it when they don't understand the cost. They don't understand if I keep it running for 2 weeks, it's still running, right? It's going to cost me. But the first thing we did was just account for it. The second thing we did was then visualize it for them so they could see it. So it's one thing to say you have X amount of bytes or terabytes or files, but then we could start to show them that. And then at the same time, we had built an HPC environment on the ground. So we wanted to start pulling the data down, and that also is a cost, and a significant cost if you do it all at the same time. So there are some, as you get used to the ecosystem of cloud providers, in particular with Amazon here, you kind of have to know the rules. So what we started to do is then find out all the latency. So it's not just a pull down. We procured a big pipe. We had it all there, but it still wasn't going fast enough. So as you start to use the systems, you start to find out where the bottlenecks are. And some of that is not a scientist trying to troubleshoot. That's IT. That's contacting Amazon saying, where are we missing that link? Especially when you're building as you're researching. So it's not like we sat there 5 years ago and said, this is exactly the way it's going to look. It doesn't look like that. It now looks like more catered to how we're using the data. So things like hashing the names of the files. But then we had to account for what was the old name. I mean, there's all kinds of nuances. As you start to see it move, you have to constantly reevaluate what's going on, and sometimes it's a bill. Sometimes it's a user being upset because they can't get their data. Sometimes it's management saying, we have a deadline, can you get to it? So we're trying to build a business around data so that we can, so when they say we want to do a research grant and they want to say, I want this many genomes and I want it to do this type of analysis and I want whatever, I can hand them a piece of paper and say, this is exactly what it is. 3 years ago, we couldn't do that. Now, I'm not saying we're 100%, but we're much better than we were 3 years ago.
Right.
I agree with that. I think accounting is really important. Knowing what you want to use your data for. I think your question was, what did we do before? I think we stored it without really necessarily always knowing what we wanted. We just knew we needed more. And that's really not a good enough answer here. More is, how long is a piece of string? So near-term storage and how you handle that is, I think, is what you were getting at too, is a pretty big thing. Another one is data structures, which is, I think there's two parts to that. One is when you set up a database in that environment, you need to optimize it. I think there was an example of using BLAST searches on Amazon, and they actually took longer because it was not optimized. So it sounds great, but I think as you were getting at before, you need to optimize that environment to do that. So having those databases that were structured to work in a particular environment now have to be set up in such a way for doing something different, one. Two, because you have the ability to ask questions in a really different way, the way that you've set up your data structure may be queried in a way you hadn't thought of before. And so you want to do either size of the pool or the kind of queries that you never thought of before that weren't set up for the kind of data structures you had originally. So you may need to rethink that, and you need to optimize for the environment. And the last one is unstructured data. So I think certainly in biology what we used to do a lot was try and figure desperately out all of the structure of the data models and put everything into little buckets. We all know that the volume of data that's coming out is quite diverse, and we want to do different kind of connections. So handling unstructured data with structured data is something that you didn't used to do locally. It just wasn't something you often did, partly because of resources, partly because you didn't have that much of it. And I think figuring out how to optimize that in the environment so that you can take the best usage of those things and how to search it effectively will be, I think, pretty key in what you're doing. And I'll add one more thing, which is if you do that with all of your data and you don't have ways to be able to find it and locate it, so we're looking at things like, does it have the right metadata tags? Are you using metadata tags that are from standardized whatever the communities are saying, so you have RNA or genomic data? Do you have unique identifiers that can be used to help with the indexing component? All of those things are critical that I think were sort of there in the past with some projects. Certainly other projects did it, but are going to be absolutely essential for the future. Otherwise, you're just going to get a huge amount of crap. Sorry, CRAP. Right?
That's okay. I've much worse words for it than that. Well, I was to say really quickly, because this conversation can go on forever about data, because it is the metadata, it's layers of data, and we're dealing with different structures that, again, 3 years ago we didn't even think about. These things are coming out so quickly, searching for them, very metadata driven for us. And we learned also not to try to over-engineer it at first. Until you really have seen it, you don't try to push it into something that you don't understand. Because if you don't understand it here and you don't understand it there, it's like doubling your problem. At least try to understand one side of it before you try to model it to some standard.
Great. All right, we're almost out of time. I think we have time for one more question. Jasper?
This is a question for Vivian. I know one of the big technical hurdles is data transfer, especially moving ELEVA flow data. I know that NIH has implemented a fully redundant science DMZ with a 100 gig pipe to Internet 2. How's that working out?
I'm the wrong person to ask that. I think the NCBI, Don Pruce, can answer that question. I know I've talked to him about it. As far as I know, it's working well, but I can't tell you more than that. I'm sure there are caveats. I would recommend you talk to Don over at NCBI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can get you information on that. The distances are very close between what they're doing. So between where the NIH is, Internet 2, and that connection over to AWS, that's very close, and they're getting extremely low latency. So I could provide more information to you about that directly from Don. So, all right, great. All right, thank you all. I think we're having a reception afterwards upstairs. But anyway, thank you, panelists. Yep. Okay.